Rawls's moral philosophy is animated by a really, really simple moral intuition. And his big claim that grounds the whole project, whether he early in his career or late, is that society should be seen and run as a fair system of cooperation from one generation to the next. It's that idea that our society should be fair. In Australia, we have this wonderful locution for it that political parties use on both sides of the spectrum. And it's saying that everyone in this country should have a quote unquote fair go. Now, if I could nominate two words for what should encapsulate the liberal spirit, I'll take my adoptive Australian home, and the fair go is perfect. Now, what's so interesting, though, about Rawls is that he doesn't say, like, I, John Rawls, mighty moral philosopher, think that liberalism should be this. What Rawls does is he looks around his world and he just kind of like does like a bit of like anthropology or like a bit of kind of armchair survey. And he's like, all right. I look at all the major political institutions in our world, things like the Constitution, political speeches, Supreme Court decisions, et cetera, et cetera. And once we kind of get all that stuff and collect it and we sift it and we try to find its bedrock moral idea, what do we find? And he says it's that idea of fairness. And his point is that everyone who has grown up in this society will sort of have imbibed this idea of fairness by virtue of being surrounded by these institutions that at least publicly profess this ideal. So here's the point. When Rawls and me say that liberalism is X and is grounded in fairness, we're not trying to legislate that as an idea. We're trying to appeal to the sensibility of our readers to say, hey, maybe you already think this, and maybe that ideal already has hooks in your heart, and we can build off of that. So rather than the neoliberal ideal that man is a wolf to man and we're all hustling and we're all portfolio building, maybe the other moral ideal, it may seem more aspirational, more idealistic in some way, but maybe it has actually more bite on us because maybe we believe it more deep down because we've been raised in a culture that professes it 24/7.
That's great. Because the next thing I wanted to ask you about is the fact that we don't really live in a liberal society. We live in liberal. Can you just define what that means?
Sure. So yeah, so the intuition, of course, is that when I say liberalism is based on fairness, and then the obvious reproach to me or to anyone who ever says that is, Alex, look out your window. Does this look like a fair world? And the obvious answer is like manifestly no, it doesn't. So what I have to come up with is what needs to be come up with more generally is this notion is a concept to designate what our world is if it's not living up to liberal principles. And I coin a word that is liberaldom, not D-U-M-B at the end, it's
Yeah, yeah.
D-O-M. And I'm riffing off the great Danish theologian of the 19th century, Soren Kierkegaard. And just bear with me for a minute and it'll become relevant. But Kierkegaard wasn't just a great theologian, he was kind of a magnificent social critic. And Kierkegaard walked around his native Copenhagen in the mid 19th century, and he looked around and everyone was basically on the same page. Everyone was professing the good life of Christ. There was a Lutheran church on every corner. People were trying to follow consciously an example. Everyone went to church, so it looks like a totally Christian world. But then Kierkegaard kind of took a beat, and he looked again at these same people, and he's like, "You guys aren't Christian at all. Like, if I really look at how you live, what you really are is kind of bourgeois. You're like respectable Philistines who want, above all, social respectability, a roast on Saturday, maybe a mistress on Sunday. Like you want like the quiet pleasures of life that won't
Mm-hmm.
shake too many boats or rattle too many whatevers. And you go to church and you profess the good life, and that's just 2 hours a week, man. And then the other part of the week, you're living some other kind of values. And he came up with this devastating word to name that world. And he called that world not a Christian world, but Christendom. And the word in Danish literally means Christian-ish,
Yeah.
Christianness. It's the world that results from play acting at Christianity. And here's the crucial thing. Kierkegaard never wrote trying to convince the Muslim or the Jew or the atheist to try to be Christian. He was writing and preaching and talking for Christians to become Christian. He wanted to convince people who already, at least notionally or publicly, profess these values to double down on them and live up to them. And he did so partly for reasons of piety, but partly because he thought that a life based on those values was intrinsically good and rewarding. Now, of course, I don't think we live in I don't think we live in Christendom anymore. I think Christian morality has passed as kind of the official public morality of most Western liberal democracies. But I do think we live in the analogous form that I coined, liberaldom, namely a society that talks the talk, but that doesn't walk the walk. And so my pitch in the book is twofold. One, I think, of course, our governments need to live up to their liberal commitments much more robustly, and that's important. And there's all kinds of reforms, political, market, legal, that those governments should pursue. Now, in the book, I don't talk so much about those. If I can recommend a book that I think does a great job at it, it's just not my project, but based on the same kind of Rawlsian ideas as me, is Daniel Chandler wrote a book last year called Free and Equal. And there he really goes at the idea of how to reform our policies, our schooling, our unions, a whole bunch of stuff along the lines of liberal ideals. And it's very wonky. Like, it gets into the weeds of what we should do. And that's great. My book, on the other hand, so I think that's terrific. We should support that. I just make a different contribution, which is to suggest how we as liberal individuals might honor our liberal commitments more in our own day-to-day lives. And that's what I'm trying to make the case. I'm trying to make the micro case rather than the micro case, though, of course, both have to go together, as to why you and I, who profess these pretty liberal sentiments, should actually take them seriously, even if they cost us at one level, because the commitment's worth it.
Well, you do have, I don't know if it's a theory of change, but you do have a prescription. And the prescription is to have John Rawls serve as your spiritual director. But it does seem to me like what you're saying is that if we think about this and strive to understand what they mean and to live up to them, that we can become better liberals and better people. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think that, they say never meet your heroes, and I think that's true 99% of the time. But I wish I had met my new hero, which is John Rawls. Every single account of him emphasizes his decency, his grace, especially his modesty. He was like low key kind all the time. And so Rawls's biography is interesting. So he wanted to be a minister up until he was about 20, and then he was in the Second World War in the Pacific Theater,
Or Second World
and
War, yeah.
learned of the Holocaust, and he lost his faith. But I don't think he ever lost his. I don't think he ever lost his. I don't know how to put this. His spiritual sensibility is the bland word, but what he thought life could give us, in some, his sense of what, to use Charles Taylor's word, his sense of fullness of what it means to be a present, generous, giving, and also happy human being in the world. And what I think he tried to do is essentially generate a political philosophy that could lead in that direction. He secularized Christianity in all kinds of ways. And so
Yeah.
people in this book often say that liberalism has religious origins, as if that's a criticism of liberalism. I don't think it is. I mean, obviously, liberalism didn't just come out of thin air one fine day, and it has a whole set of antecedents, I think, in Christianity, but in particular in Reformed Christianity. And I think now, though, that it's able, and with 200 years of kind of working itself out, I think liberalism is able to stand on its own 2 feet. And I think that that's what Rawls tried to do, establish what a liberal worldview might mean, and especially politically, but also morally. He elaborated a whole moral psychology as to what it might claim to us. So what I try to do, sorry, I'm wandering a little bit here, but what I'm trying to do in the book is take some of his most important, his greatest hits, as it were. Like, if you had a Rawls, like the Eagles' greatest hits, the Rawls' greatest hits, and you put it on an album, and number one track would be the original position. It's the concept that anyone who has ever looked at Rawls knows something about. And then other bangers, as it were, the reflective equilibrium, public reason. And I kind of go through the list of what they would be. And I try to suggest that they're not just kind of political ideas, but in some important and deep way, and I think untapped way, they're spiritual ideas. And I call them spiritual practices or spiritual exercises that people can take on to themselves to become a different kind of person. So the original position, I won't get into the details, but the original position, the whole idea there is to try to imagine us as a bit more impartial. We try to think of like what we would want of our societies if we didn't know our place in it. So if I didn't know that I was, take me, a white, heterosexual, middle class kind of guy, and I were to design my society, like, what kind of principles would I nominate if I didn't know who I was? And Rawls's point is, we all basically want to think that way, right? None of us would accept that creating principles of justice in our image of our position is fair or right or good or anything. Like, if I were to designate rules for whites or rules for kind of middle class heterosexual guys, that's obviously not okay, not just to the broader society, but to my own moral conscience. I would be repelled by that. And Rawls is trying to get us, in a sense, to get some distance from who we are, and our own kind of the luck or unluckiness of our positionality, and try to think of how we would want our society to look like, but also how our own lives to look like. And so what I try to do in the book is try to suggest how that idea of an original position can be used as, I don't know, a meditative exercise, something that we can just kind of call up whenever we like, and to just get our heads in order and get, maybe at a limit, our lives in order and live a certain kind of way. And last thing I'll say about this, but we can go there if you like. The claim that I think Rawls makes is that we should do that not just because it's like the right thing to do or that it will help vulnerable people, though it does do that. His claim is that if you live a life according to liberal ideals, it is intrinsically rewarding on its own terms. Like there's a lot of good stuff that comes out of that. And I call them, I'm being a bit cheeky here, but I call them the existential perks of liberalism. And
Mhm.
like you have your seven virtues of liberalism. I have my 17. I don't mean to trump you. It's not a competitive exercise, but I have my 17 reasons to be liberal, and all of them are kind of qualities of character. Things like some of them
Yep.
are high end, like impartiality and autonomy, like very liberal sounding things. But other than it's like you get to be more chill in the world. You get to be more thankful. You get to be kind of funny.
Mhm.
Like there's certain qualities of character that spring from our liberalism, and that's what I think Rawls was on about. Reasons as to why we ought to be liberal. It's the oldest problem of political philosophy when you think about it. Plato, at the very beginning of the tradition in the Republic, asked the big question that would never not occupy us, which is why be just? And he had to reply to these badass critics, Thrasymachus, Callicles, you name them, who are like, I want to be a tyrant. Being a tyrant is awesome. Look at all you get to do. And Socrates had to come up with reasons as to why, not just that tyranny is bad, but that tyranny is bad for you, and that living according to these other values is not just good for society, but is good for you. And that's what I'm trying to do in the book, suggest that living up to these liberal values is good, I think, at a macro level for society, sure, but that it has its own rewards and benefits that are not to be underestimated.